Between 2013 and 2016, a team of researchers ran one of the strangest, largest experiments in the history of behavioral science. They planted over 17,000 fake lost wallets in 355 cities across 40 countries, handed them to hotel staff, banks, and other institutions as if they'd simply been found on the ground, and then tracked how many people actually tried to return them to the owner listed inside. Each wallet was built to look completely plausible: a clear plastic case, 3 business cards, a grocery list handwritten in the local language, and a key, the kind that suggests genuine personal significance to whoever lost it. The person receiving the wallet had no idea they were part of a study. As far as they knew, someone had simply come across a stranger's lost belongings and handed them over at the front desk, expecting the staff member to do the right thing without anyone watching or grading the decision. The wallets weren't identical everywhere. Some had no money. Some had around $13. A handful of countries got wallets with closer to $94 inside, just to see whether more money made people more or less likely to give it back. The results, published in the journal Science in 2019, produced a global honesty ranking nobody was fully expecting, and Denmark and Sweden landed near the very top of it, alongside Switzerland, Norway, and the Netherlands, with return rates in some measures reaching into the high 70s and 80%. The United States, for comparison, came in closer to the middle of the pack, and countries like China, Morocco, and Peru sat near the bottom. Real quick, if these videos bring you something, following the channel genuinely helps and takes about 2 seconds. Today, what that wallet experiment actually revealed, why Nordic countries in particular keep showing up at the top of trust research like this, again and again, across completely different studies, and whether that trust is really about pure honesty or something a little more structural underneath it. Let's start with the most counterintuitive part of the actual findings, because it complicates the simple story a lot of people assume going in. The researchers found that wallets with more money in them were consistently more likely to be returned, not less, across almost every country in the study, including the ones with lower overall return rates. That's the opposite of what a purely self-interested, rational calculation would predict. If people were coldly weighing the value of the cash against the risk of getting caught, more money should have meant more temptation to simply keep it. Instead, more money seemed to trigger a stronger sense that returning it mattered, which the researchers interpreted as evidence that most people, across most cultures, are motivated less by fear of punishment and more by a genuine aversion to thinking of themselves as a thief. That baseline finding, that most humans everywhere lean honest rather than purely self-interested, is actually the less surprising part of the study. What's more interesting is why some countries cluster so much higher than others on top of that baseline. The research team pointed to a specific cluster of factors that showed up disproportionately in the highest-scoring countries: strong social safety nets, lower income inequality, high civic and political participation. Nordic countries scored unusually high on all 3 simultaneously, which the researchers suggested might encourage what they described as a broader sense of responsibility toward strangers, not just toward family or close friends, a distinction that matters a great deal once you start looking at how trust actually gets structured day to day. This connects to something worth naming directly, a distinction sociologists sometimes draw between 2 different kinds of trust. Particularized trust is trust extended specifically to people you already know: family, close friends, your own community. Generalized trust is trust extended to strangers by default, people you've never met and likely never will, simply because the social fabric around you makes that trust feel reasonably safe to extend. A lot of cultures run heavily on the first kind: deep loyalty within a tight circle, real caution outside it. Nordic countries score unusually high specifically on the second kind: generalized trust toward people entirely outside any personal network, which is exactly the kind of trust a lost wallet experiment is actually measuring. Nobody returning a stranger's wallet in a hotel lobby has any personal relationship with that stranger to protect. The trust has to come from somewhere else entirely. This distinction shows up clearly in decades of survey research too, separate from the wallet experiment specifically. A recurring question in international social surveys asks respondents a simple version of, generally speaking, Would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people? Nordic countries have consistently posted some of the highest agreement rates with the first option, most people can be trusted, of any region tracked globally, decade after decade, across multiple waves of the survey. That consistency matters. A single wallet experiment could theoretically be a fluke of timing or method, a multi-decade pattern showing up in an entirely different kind of research. Simple self-reported survey questions rather than a real-world behavioral test suggests the wallet study wasn't measuring some strange one-off anomaly. It was measuring something durable and structural that shows up reliably no matter how researchers choose to test for it. You can see this generalized trust showing up constantly in ordinary daily life across the Nordic region, well beyond a controlled research experiment. It's genuinely common to see a baby left sleeping outside a cafe in a stroller while a parent sits inside, entirely out of arm's reach, based on a real, culturally shared confidence that a sleeping baby on a public street isn't in danger from other people passing by. Unlocked doors, in smaller towns particularly, remain far more common than in a lot of other developed countries. None of this is naivety. It's the lived, everyday expression of the exact same generalized trust the wallet study, measured in a more controlled, formal setting. There's a specific version of this worth mentioning because it shows how deeply the trust extends into formal systems, not just casual social behavior. Nordic tax systems in several countries rely heavily on pre-filled returns, where the government calculates most of what a citizen owes automatically, based on income data already reported by employers and banks, and the citizen simply reviews and confirms it rather than calculating everything from scratch. That system only works smoothly at scale if a large majority of the population isn't actively trying to hide income or game the numbers, and if citizens, in turn, trust that the government's calculation is accurate and fair, rather than a mechanism for quietly overcharging them. It's a two-directional trust relationship, citizens trusting the state to calculate correctly, and the state trusting citizens not to need adversarial, exhaustive verification of every single return. Countries with lower baseline social trust generally can't run a tax system this streamlined, because too much of it would need active, expensive enforcement rather than passive, mutual confidence. Quick break, this is the ad part. I built something I'm genuinely excited to share, called the Scandinavian Reset. It's not another video, it's a real guide, worksheets and all, built to help you bring some of this same calm, structured trust in your own systems into your own daily life. Links in the pinned comment, or you can find it directly at www.scandinaviansecrets.shop. Back to the video. Now, the honest complication, because presenting Nordic trust as some kind of pure, uncomplicated virtue would flatten a more interesting reality. The researchers behind the wallet study were careful to note that their findings were correlational, not proof of a specific cause. High trust and strong social safety nets tend to travel together, but that doesn't fully settle which one is producing the other, or whether some third factor, historical homogeneity, smaller population size, a particular political history, is quietly driving both at once. It's tempting to conclude that strong government programs simply manufacture trust directly. The more accurate picture is probably closer to a reinforcing loop. Trust makes people more willing to fund generous, universal social programs through taxation, because they believe the money will actually reach people who need it rather than being wasted or stolen. Those programs then reduce the kind of desperation and inequality that erodes trust in the first place. Each side feeds the other, which makes the whole system durable, but also makes it much harder to simply copy by importing one piece without the rest. There's a specific historical thread researchers have pointed to when trying to explain how this loop originally got started, worth mentioning even though it remains genuinely debated. Nordic countries share a history of relatively small, historically homogeneous populations, strong local self-governance traditions dating back centuries, and comparatively weak, less exploitative colonial and feudal legacies than many other parts of Europe. Some researchers argue this created fertile ground for generalized trust to take root early, since fewer deep historical grievances existed between different groups within the same country. and local governance structures gave ordinary citizens genuine practice cooperating with people outside their immediate family for centuries, before modern welfare states existed at all. This is one explanation among several competing ones, and the debate among historians and social scientists about the precise origin remains active. What's less debated is that whatever started the loop, once high trust and strong institutions existed together, they reinforced each other powerfully enough to persist for generations. There's a second honest complication worth naming too. High generalized trust doesn't mean crime or dishonesty are entirely absent in Nordic countries. It means the baseline expectation runs differently than it does elsewhere, which is a distinction with real consequences, but not a claim that these countries have somehow eliminated bad behavior altogether. Property crime and fraud still exist. What the trust research actually measures is something narrower and more specific: the default assumption a stranger makes about another stranger's intentions before any evidence exists one way or the other. That default sits higher in Nordic countries than almost anywhere else measured, but it's a statistical tendency across an entire population, not a guarantee about any single individual interaction. It's also worth noting that trust levels aren't perfectly uniform even within these countries, and treating them as a monolith would oversimplify the picture. Trust in institutions and trust in strangers can move somewhat independently of each other, and researchers have documented shifts over time linked to factors like rising immigration and integration challenges, economic downturns, and generational change. Some recent survey waves have shown modest softening in certain trust indicators in parts of the Nordic region compared to their historic peaks, even while these countries continue to rank near the top globally in absolute terms. High trust isn't a fixed cultural trait immune to change. It's closer to a maintained condition, sustained by ongoing social and economic circumstances, which means it's genuinely possible for it to erode under different conditions, the same way it appears to have been built up in the first place. So what actually explains Denmark and Sweden landing near the top of a 17,000 wallet global experiment? It's not one single cultural trait operating in isolation. It's a reinforcing loop between strong institutions, low inequality, and a genuine, extended sense of responsibility toward people entirely outside your own personal circle, built up over generations and constantly reinforced by the fact that trusting strangers has, statistically, kept paying off often enough to justify doing it again. Trust like that isn't naive. In a system actually built to support it, it's closer to the most rational strategy available, which might be the most surprising finding buried in that entire 17,000 wallet experiment. There's a version of this worth reflecting on personally, even without access to a Nordic-style welfare state or centuries of small population governance history. Generalized trust, at the individual level, functions less like a fixed personality trait and more like a habit that gets reinforced by evidence, in either direction. Someone who defaults to suspicion of strangers tends to interact with the world in ways that make suspicion feel confirmed more often, avoiding vulnerable situations, assuming the worst before evidence arrives, missing the ordinary, unremarkable interactions where a stranger simply behaves decently and nothing notable happens at all. Someone who defaults to a baseline of reasonable trust, calibrated but not naive, tends to accumulate more evidence of the opposite over time. Small daily confirmations that most people, most of the time, aren't looking to take advantage of a moment of vulnerability. Neither pattern proves anything about human nature in general. Both patterns tend to become somewhat self-fulfilling for the specific person living inside them. That's really the quieter lesson sitting underneath a study about lost wallets and a culture built around leaving strollers outside cafes. Trust, at scale, isn't primarily a moral quality some populations happen to possess and others lack. It's closer to an infrastructure, built deliberately, tested constantly, and either reinforced or eroded by what actually happens each time it gets extended. Denmark and Sweden didn't end up near the top of a global honesty ranking because their citizens are inherently better people than citizens anywhere else. They ended up there because generations of institutions, policy, and daily lived experience kept making trust the rational bet, over and over again, until trusting a stranger stopped feeling like a risk and started feeling like simply how things are done. If this changed how you think about trust, following the channel means a lot. And drop your next video idea in the comments. I read every single one, and a lot of what ends up here starts right there. Och som alltid, vi ses nästa gång.